So today we're looking at a Charles Barget plate, and I wanted to show you the steps. So materials, I'm going to be using graphite pencils. Now, if you don't have a series of graphite pencils, one pencil, a number 2 pencil, it's fine. For this exercise, I generally recommend pencil, graphite, or charcoal because we will be working a little bit of light and shadow. Yes, you could work with ink, if you feel comfortable with it, but generally graphite charcoal will do the trick better. I also have an eraser, a paper blender, if you don't know what that is. It's basically something to smudge the graphite or the charcoal. A Q-tip, paper, toilet paper, or tissue paper do the job just as fine. So I want to show you the steps. We go back to step 1. Now, I like to show you the formula. For those of you who are using the graphite pencils, I'm going to be using an HB, followed by a 2B, moving to a 4B, and finishing with the 6B. So what are we doing here? We're working from light to dark. So the lightest pencil, hardest pencil, to the softest, darker pencil. And that's what I'll be doing for stage 1. Hopefully we won't need the eraser too much, and we'll use the blending tools when we get to the light. So I want to go over a few things, what it is we're trying to do here. And it's the same formula as always. We're going to be drawing lines, whether they're vertical lines, horizontal lines, diagonal lines, all of them straight. So if you look at this first step, what we have here are basically straight lines. And we're basically blocking. And blocking means kind of sculpting out of lines variety of shapes. Now, very important to not forget that some of these lines, we're working from a formula of biggest to smaller, from simplest to more complex. So these lines should be absolutely simple. And the main thing that you should be looking at here is the length, obviously the direction, but most important of all, the angle. So one good tip that I give for angles, if you have a tool, using your pencil. So obviously you're looking at my screen. If I were to place, if you have a reference, that is a printed reference or even a digital reference, you're going to want to place your pencil right over it and just bring it over. And that should basically guide your angle. No matter what the angle is, you're going to want to try to capture that angle as close as possible. That is the biggest and most important thing in this first step. So, starting with the line, and notice that we're going to start at level 1 or stage 1 here, reminding you that we'll go to a little more mapping where we break the straight lines into smaller, more curved lines, and also a little bit of the mapping of light and shadow, and then finishing up with a beautiful rendering of a profile. So not forgetting this final stage, keeping it in mind as we work from this first one. So what I'm trying to say is you could actually work this foundational, the skeleton of this, while looking at this. The idea would be that. But obviously I want to show you step by step. This is how you would develop a portrait while looking at a profile like this. What you want to see is this. So for those of you who want to follow step by step alongside with me, we can do that. If you're ready to take a look at this and try to build a scaffold, that skeleton while looking at this image that you see on screen now, that's perfect as well. So here we go. So we start with obviously proportions, and I want to make sure I have a good measurement. So one good measurement is, well, if I place it in the middle, it's going to be probably too close to the edge. So I want to make sure I pull it over to this side. Now, how far to the left? Well, I'm going to leave a little bit of edge so it's a nice composition, and I'm going to draw out my vertical line. So this is called our plumb line, our vertical line. And remember, we're not writing, we're drawing. So the grip, how you grip your pencil, and notice that I want you to try and practice to hold it as long as possible, also as soft as possible. It's all about direction, pace, and pressure. So you can really use your shoulder, your wrist, your elbow to draw these lines. Now, I remind you, I'm using the lightest pencil I have here, HB, to draw large, simple, straight, light lines. So that is as close as I can get to a vertical line. Is it perfect? Not really. But because it's not final, it's fine. Now, one big measurement that we need here is this. We have a couple of diagonals, and you want to make sure you measure that. But how do I know the ratio of width to height? We want to make sure we have at least one measurement where I want to bring this over to my reference. And again, you could just place it right over, and using the tip of your pencil and your finger, you can actually make those measurements. So if I were to take the side to the tip of the nose right here, and then measure that against the height, how many of those that would it be? Would it be 1 3/4, 2, 2.5? And you can actually make that measurement now. Let's see what I got here. And making sure your points, how you see the points, and where you place those markers allow you to see this the way you need to see it. And there's no exact formula for making these measurements. Another thing I want to bring up is what we're doing today is sketching. It's an exercise, but most important of all, it's an exercise in observation. So we all see the same thing. We're looking at the same thing, but we all see different ways. So starting with my vertical, I see it as almost 1 to 2. So the next step would be to mark the measurement. And in a general sense, just give myself a small little marker right here to kind of guide me for the next step. What is that next step? Well, it's finding these smaller angles. So beginning with the block, I use placing my pencil right over the angle and bringing it over to my pencil. Now, these lines don't have to be precise in length. They could continue all the way across. But it's easier if you begin to just also manage the length of the line alongside with the angle. So here's one. I'll double check that angle one more time. Bring it over just a little more. Now, another tip I generally I like to give is think of the hands of a clock. So this could be 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock. Now this is definitely not 3 o'clock. It's more 4 o'clock. Is it 5 o'clock? That's how you begin to make those, and it's only a 15-degree range where you need to be closer to 4 than 5 or closer to 3 than 4 if you can visualize it that way. So let's go to the next measurement, which would be down here. And just bringing that alongside, same way, I'm going to create same measurement of angle and begin to create the block. And when I said biggest and simplest, we almost want to start with a square or rectangle, which we almost do here in a way. I could just draw this vertical line that you see coming straight across. And this is also used for a different method, which is sight measurement. But we're going to skip that one for today. We'll bring it in a future session. We want to keep this as simple as possible. And you can see how this is basically just a simple geometric shape from which I can now begin to also make smaller adjustments. I could begin to draw these smaller angles, like the small little triangle that you see shaping up here. But remember, what we want to do is work from biggest and simplest to smaller and more complex. So what would be the next line? Well, you saw me just now draw this. I want to take a second measurement, and where would that be? It's literally, just by looking at it, it is almost halfway point. And I'm talking about this point here. So I have my width, but I need to bring this intuitively. I just want to bring it down where it would measure almost at the halfway point. Now, I need to confirm this, so I want to make sure that I have, whether it's this point or in the back, I want to make sure I'm measuring from the proper position. So I want to make sure this angle is revised. And from this point to where it crosses the line right here at the top of the forehead, or what will be the forehead, I want to make that measurement to what is, and looks like, almost exactly at the middle. And now you see another pair of lines that, as we begin to cross them, it actually, you could, if you wanted to, skip some of those measurements and just play with this formula of finding the angle and making that crossing intersection of lines. And as you begin to see lines in the proper angle, crossing, giving you a new point of reference. So for example, we have this new point here where these two cross. Well, guess what? Just a little bit below, we have another angle and another line. So what I mean is, don't overthink it. Don't overstress with the measurements. That comes with practice. But focus mostly on the angle, trying to capture the angle of those lines. Okay, so once again, I mentioned seeing the way you see here is going to be, we have an angle, intersection point, and now we have a couple of lines. So I want to make sure I make a good read on what seems to be just horizontal lines. There may be a tiny bit of an angle towards 2 o'clock. And then the measurements, which I know are almost at a third. So if I measure this intersection point to this bottom point, another intersection down here, notice that we have 1, 2, and 3. Is that right? Double check it. And you can almost compare the distance, noticing that they're not equal. There's a little more space between first and second, then second and third. How much? Again, that's where measuring would come in. But you begin to see how they line up. I also want to make sure that these lines are interacting with all of the other lines that I placed earlier. Just make that a little more obvious since I'm trying to work a little lighter. So I can then begin to carve it out. Now, any which way you want to start, there is a logic to this. Some may want to start here. Now make sure you double check these angles, and as close as you can, you're going to want to match. If you have the angle, you most likely will have the length. So we have another intersection point, and we have a small angle here. Now this is where you could work the lines, and all of them should be straight lines. You're basically building that skeleton that I mentioned earlier, and carving out almost as if it were out of stone. I'm going to begin to look at negative space. So what is negative space? I'm going to say a word that I don't want you to think about, but if I say nose, yeah, you see this shape here that's coming along, but can you see the triangle that is made between the nose and this line that we drew here earlier? So there is a small angle, which is the air or the space around our subject, which we call negative space. And that's the one that pretty much gives you all of the clues that you need confirmation. Because if you see this shape here, you can actually take a look at this shape. And I almost feel tempted to fill it in. But I'm making it as obvious as I can. This triangle here, does it look like the triangle in our reference? Now you can match this much easier. And with more and more experience, more practice, it will get even closer to the sharp or obtuse angles that you will be working with. So instead of looking at the shape of the subject, you look at the negative shapes. So negative space here, we have a small little line. And as we begin to move away from big and simple, we may get carried away and lose sight of our angles, which, by the way, when they get smaller, they need to be, in a way, more accurate. But once you have this foundation, anything you build upon it should be, let's call it fine or healthy. Strong is actually a better word. So notice again, here I'm drawing the outer negative space where I see a triangle that kind of confirms the angle of the line. And while I built that scaffold, I know that the angle of the line and the length of the line match. Let's go down to this intersection point. And here we have a very important one. And we have a couple of triangles forming through these intersecting lines. And finally, we have this very interesting triangle with a very, very sharp point and edge. And again, you see it because we have this diagonal line. That was the early setup for another triangle. And there we have it. Now we have a couple of lines that come into play. So you may have noticed here the ridge, and you have that measurement, of course, with the small line that points to a very, very slight angle going up. And again, I'm doing this mostly intuitive, which you should be very comfortable doing as well. And we have a major intersecting line or a shape line that comes in this direction here. So this is where you want to spend most of your logic, most of your analytic, and most patient. Well, somewhat. It does need patience all the way through. But if you have this, and you can step back a few feet and look at it and say, oh yes, it's in the ballpark. Anything you do from here should file and get much and much easier. The more we add, the more clues we get from what we add, which in a way, it's said that the more lines we add, the more problems we create. But at the same time, the more lines we add, the more problems we are solving. I need to make this just a little lighter, anticipating also a little bit of and revising that angle. Now think about this for a second. If there were major changes that you needed to do here, guess what? You take your eraser and there's not a lot of loss. This is, again, scaffolding, foundational, blocking of our subject, which allows us to move to stage 2. Now, whoa, how did we get here now? We begin to see all these more anatomical features or lines. But remember, we are just drawing straight lines. And we want to stay drawing straight lines as long as possible. So what happens to a straight line like this one when I break it into 2 or 3 smaller diagonal lines? Well, they give me the illusion of a curve. And some of them could still remain straight line. Bring in a little bit of eraser here to add and clean up some of those exterior lines, which were and could still be a little helpful. Remember, really paying attention to your grip is very important. And if you're feeling lost, like, whoa, I don't know where to go next here, remember, you can always refer back to here. Everything we're doing is based on the image you see here. So, some of these lines that we begin to see falling down, creating more negative space, are really based on observation of the actual image, the last image that I'm presenting here, which is fully finished, or where we're aiming to. But in this case, I want to stick to this step by step. And what I'm doing here is just to give you a hint. Well, it's not features, it's these lines. What are they doing? Well, what they are doing, in fact, is mapping out light and shadow. So everything that I'm drawing here is going to be in the shadow family. And everything that's out here is going to be in the light family. So taking a look, once again, at the final image, you could see, if you squint at it, how you have a shape that is all dark, and you have a massive shape that is in light, or you have a few shapes. So you see shapes that are down in here, and all of the shape as one big light shape. We want to see this as close as possible as one shadow shape. So once again, we follow, and this is a little more intuitive. We try to capture the angle. We continue the work of angle and line. But what you definitely want to do is work and follow the step by step. Don't move ahead until that stage is ready. Now, other things you should be looking at is relationships. So this line is my first diagonal line coming across, which has a smaller line, and just trying to follow those angles, giving me more clues. Now the relationship, are they lining up? Is this supposed to be higher or lower than this point? And giving that reference, you should be able to manage putting together this shape and beginning to see why, what was the purpose of this here, where I could begin to carve out a little more of the final image through seeing these breaks in these straight lines. So for example, here we have the nasal bone, and you could see the angle of it that then drops down. Also, the lines begin to get a little bit, I'm still using the same pencil, but you could move one pencil up if you wanted to work these darker lines. I'm still trying to stick to lighter, and another break. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 2 lines that became 4 lines. And you can immediately see that that is more than enough to give you sort of a personality or a identifier, a characteristic to this nose. The likeness, which is what we call it. Now, as always, I remind you, when working with graphite or charcoal, or any medium for that matter, your paper should be caressed. So what I'm doing here with graphite is caressing the paper. You do not want to go too dark too fast. You want to actually stay as light as possible, as long as possible, in order to make any correction or adjustment that you need to make at any given moment. Now, if something is confusing, if you went a little too far and you're lost, make sure you don't go any further until you find a marker, a tip, a clue that allows you to continue putting all of the pieces together. Because you've heard me say this before. We're putting together a puzzle piece by piece. So you can't just jam that piece where it doesn't, and the further along you get, the harder it is. It's better if you pace yourself, slow down, and now we have a couple of shifts here where I really need to see how these elements relate to the later portrait that we're drawing. But I could show this to a class of kindergartners, and I am pretty sure they'll say it's a face. So that's a good sign. And as we move along, I'm going to see that this comes in, and this is going to carve just inside, giving me a little extra negative space. So a little bit of correction from the first stage to the second, if necessary. You see me erasing some of those lines to make it just a little bit clearer. And it really begins to make more and more sense as I continue adding more lines. Always paying attention to the most important thing, that angle of the line. So how does it feel so far? Take a break, step back, a few seconds and a few feet are recommended every minute, actually. Depending on the pace you're working, you want to take a couple of steps back for a few seconds every couple of, or at least every minute, to make sure you're keeping everything and giving it a full view, a holistic view, so you could see the whole and how everything, is it in proportion? Before I move forward, am I on the right track? And I think giving it a quick overview, I'm ready to move to stage 3. So this is where it gets really interesting and fun. I hope I'm not working too fast. But you do have all these references, so you can pace yourself. But I'm going to move to the third. So, whoa, we have all of it, basically. This is what throws you off. How do I keep working in that simplistic way? How do I see the things that are all of a sudden thrown at me now? We see all these shapes of hair and wrinkles in the forehead and beard and mustache and shadows. How do I keep that? How can I see it the way I was seeing everything all the way up to here? So simple and so easy. Well, that's the work. It's managing how you see. Remember, I mentioned it's an exercise in observation. So we all look at the same thing, but we all see it differently. And we all take different paths, different directions. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick, closer look at shadow. And this shadow shape, I am going to very carefully, very lightly give it a... I switched pencil, by the way. I'm up to a 2B now. And I'm going to give it just one layer. Now if you look closely, if you have a good print, a good reference, there's a lot of variation. It's not just one value of shadow. There's light and darker shadows within that shadow. So I would say there's at least well, there's a variety of them, but at least three. A light dark, a medium, and a heavy dark that actually breaks this shape into smaller shapes. You could see nostrils, you could see in and around cheekbone, some of the features of the eye as well. Let me go to the third here, and there we are. So generally speaking, you want to also notice how I'm working all in one direction. So it's the lines, and every single thing I've done here is a line. But you see how these lines all of a sudden became shapes? And now I'm going to turn these shapes into forms. So these forms, the illusion is to make them look three-dimensional. How do I do that? Well, we want to maintain the direction of the side of the form, the way the light, it's basically a study of light, understanding how light behaves on this forehead, on this skin. Notice there was a small marker here. Now it makes sense. If you hadn't seen it before, it's going to be also in the shadow family. And this one here, there was a little line here in stage 1 and 2. I'm sorry, stage 2 mostly, which now we see is the marker for the hair and cheekbone. But you could see how, as we begin and continue to add soft, layer by layer, and it will take a few, maybe 2 or 3 passes for us to bring it. And again, following the rule, as we said before, biggest and simplest to smaller and more complex, along with lightest to darkest. So you see me begin to add dark. And also following the direction of my subject here. So I'm tempted to rearrange. And all of the adjustments that we would need to make here should be based on how we developed our early stages. So here's where I would bring in, for the first stage, I would bring in a paper blender or a Q-tip or tissue paper and soften, blend. Although I'm using a 2B, I'm just going to draw and shape this first layer with a little bit of curvature. So now, as I draw light, we're beyond lines, shapes. Now we're dealing with form. So the only way you really develop form is through light. And light is basically understanding shifting values from the lightest, which is the white of the paper, to the darkest, which will be my final layer with the 6B. And everything in between should be strategized. So I can slowly, and notice here we don't have sharp edges anymore. Those lines begin to turn into, the word is concave or convex. Meaning, is it rounding in or is it rounding out? And this is where drawing really becomes fun. I mean, it's all fun all the time, always, all the way through. But this really shows when you can actually read, interpret light, and understand your subject through the shapes of shadow and light. That's what really, it's what it's all about, honestly. So notice how some areas begin to go from what would be this considered as black. It's the darkest on the page now, but it won't be because I will be layering. And again, I'm caressing the paper, especially when I'm blending. I want to make sure I don't hurt the paper. I don't fuzzy it or rip it. So the level of pressure that you use. Now, if you don't have a paper blender optimally, you can use your finger. Now, I don't recommend doing that because, you know, it only gets you so far. Plus, there's oils on your finger that don't really mix well with graphite. There we go. And that would be considered stage 1. So intuitively, you begin to see where this needs to go next. You begin to see how light washes over, fades, darkens in terms of shadow here. I just switched to a 4B. I know I'm kind of, I don't want to say rushing through, but I am moving ahead. The next step would be that. It would be with a 4B. But the one thing you don't want is to really rush and jump in contrast. You want to make these steps very gradient, very smooth from one to the next. You don't want a sharp contrast from the previous. It's automatic. I'm doing this very softly. I'm starting here at the top because I want to see a little more of the shape of the forehead. So a little bit of the edge, the contour, and how it rounds up all the way to the top. Now, you may say, well, the light is actually not vertical, but more horizontal and rounding this way. So you want the line to also follow that direction. So I'm going more horizontal diagonal, kind of in the direction of the skin. Also in the direction of, for example, this wrinkle here on the forehead. And when is it time to add graphite or blend the graphite? Well, that's up to you. And that begins to develop your technique. So you make the call. Now notice, I was drawing horizontal. So I also want to blend horizontal just to follow. So if I did it this direction, it's going to flatten it out. So in order to enhance the illusion, I'm going to blend it in the same direction that I'm laying it down. And as I soften the pressure, you see how there's a little bit of a gradient that gives me that soft edge that now reads as a round forehead. And you can begin to see, well, yep, there's the beginnings of developing of an illusion of a portrait of a man, profile, where we can exactly see where the light is coming from. So my lines, which used to be all, and still are, pretty much straight, begin to now function as guides for me to break, but they could almost remain as is and still work. Yes, I want to give it a little more curvature, a little more contour, a little more, again, convex, concave. The softer and longer you actually deliver these layers, the better in terms of technique. When graphite, at least with graphite, the slower you develop, and I mean slower meaning you don't want to pressure the graphite into the paper too fast. You want to really, it's the best word I can come up with, caress it on. So the longer it takes, the better the result will be, because you're literally layering graphite over paper and then graphite over graphite. So the more pressure you add to it, the more you'll lose the layering of graphite on paper. It'll be graphite, that's when it gets shiny. If you've ever seen when a drawing gets really nice, but all of a sudden it's very shiny in some areas, that's because you're actually adding too much pressure or too much speed. It could be either or, to an area where graphite won't receive as nice as if you would take your time and manage that pressure. So here I need to bring in a little more. Now this is a tip. Sometimes you have graphite left over on the tip of your paper blender that you could bring to other areas. And because it's already worn, it's a little lighter, you can actually manage the values of it much, much better. So I come into here where there's a lot of graphite, and I usually keep up something along, just another piece of paper, where if I need to wipe it out, off of my paper blender, I'll just wipe on a separate sheet of paper, scrap piece of paper, making sure I don't bring too much graphite where I don't want it. So we begin to see a little shift. We begin to see features in the eye. And some of you may be all the way up to 4B or 6B or 8B. But remember, the main thing is not to rush. And the other thing is, the closer we get to the finish line, the closer we get to the end, we begin to perceive, ooh, it's almost done. Something, somehow, makes us want to rush. That's actually when you have to slow down. What we call the finishing touches, they are crucial. And since they are less, you really need to manage your pace at that point. And obviously your focus, because all of the work that it took to get here could be lost very, very easily in one misstep of the final stage, where it does get a little more delicate. It does obviously get more complex, and because there's already so much there, it could easily get lost by, I use the metaphor of overcooking. When you put a little salt or you heat it up a little and then whoops, it went too far, you can't bring it back. At any stage before here, you were able to make all the mistakes you want and still bring it back. At this point, it gets more and more complicated. And the reason is, you're going to see things that I absolutely love. But if I did a, oops, I lost it. And the truth is, you'll lose it forever. Once it's gone, it's almost impossible to bring what you had there back. So how do we read concave, convex? Well, the best way is working from life. So my suggestion is, where do you go next? Well, catch someone watching TV, tell them to stay still for a little bit, profile, make sure there's a nice light, hopefully something that resembles this, and then do it from life. And you will get an absolutely complete different feeling, which is what drawing from life does. Where then this is going to feel like, well, that was kids' play. Now, it's the real deal. When you actually see light at work, not working from a reference, it's demanding because you have to solve all of the problems. You create the problems and then you have to solve them. Here the problems are pretty much solved for all of us already. So obviously it makes that a little bit easier. So make sure you pay attention to how you're managing pressure, how you're able to caress the paper, pretty much paint it on. When we're drawing, we're painting graphite onto paper. We don't realize that, but that's what it is. So the thinner and softer the layers, the richer they read. Just adding more material as we're coming to near the end. And we have more shapes coming together, finalizing it. All of them dealing with more light and shadow. And to see light and shadow as shapes. That's what's important. That's what we were trying to do today. So you see this whole shape here. Now it becomes more and more irregular, but at one point I could identify it as just a few lines. If you remember that. Once I begin blending, obviously it becomes more and more its own shape. And actually beyond shape, it becomes a form. So I'm going to go ahead and give one last blend here to a few of these areas and finalize. Use my last pencil here, which will be a 4B. So when you have that and you've strategized to get to this point, it should look like, yep, it's just a few tiny details that need to come together. Most of them are not dealing with line anymore. It's almost all dealing with value. So shaping of that light. It's also more and more intuitive. But as you can see, a lot of fun. So here's my 6B. That's what I'm moving to. So with my 6B, I'm going to really, this is, again, just a few touches. And you could hopefully see where I lay down a few lines. The difference is instantaneous. So I want to be careful. This is that icing on the cake, basically. You want to be... You want to be thinking the reason why you're putting it there. It's because you see it. Don't get carried away and overdo something that you're not completely sure about. So I see smaller shapes where it really develops into the darkest darks. And remember, squinting at your subject reveals these areas. And once again, blending. It gets, like I said, it gets smaller, more complex. So the blending also becomes a little more tactical and a little more strategic. But immediately you see how rich. And some of these, there's areas where you're going to see a little more line becoming. So for example, some of these linear elements here where you see beard and a little bit of break. So that's where you bring in your intuitive skills, observation skills all along, and begin to break that down. One final note, which is using eraser to draw with to bring back light. So in certain areas, for example, let's say here in this part of the mustache, I could just touch my eraser, and there are a variety of erasers. I'm using just a regular block eraser here. You could use, and I should have it at hand, my kneaded eraser, or some of these smaller pen-like erasers that are so popular now, because they are pretty amazing. But remember, just to draw with. And in case you're wondering, well, if I'm up to 6B, can I go back to 4B or 2B? Yes, absolutely. Managing the level of the value. Look at these beautiful shapes here, where you can actually draw almost linear, a little bit of the shape, and then come back and blend that by reading the light. Which way is the light going? And being able to see how the shadow is supposed to be on this side. Always the light is coming from this direction. So everything that hits this side is going to be in shadow. And this would be one great place to maybe go back to all the way back to an HB, where we have some of these finer lines. That'll be obviously finer, more detailed, and lighter to finish up some of that. Some of that hair. And once again, doing the back and forth. With nice, smooth approach and patience. And again, it doesn't have to be that way. You could be very gestural and very using this as just a reference for more gestural or even abstract type of work. But we know the purpose here is taking our anatomy, our portraiture, our use of medium a little bit further to develop a skill that we could then adopt and practice with to create our own. So there we have it. I hope you guys enjoyed it.